So last lecture we talked about the motions of the Earth and the Sun in the sky, or rather, how it is that the Earth is moving, causing the motions that we see of some of the stuff in the sky. Well, today we're going to start talking about the Moon. So if you remember previously, we talked about how half of the Earth is lit by sunlight. Okay, so we have the half of the Earth that is facing towards the Sun, and then the half that is away. The side facing towards the Sun, this is day. The side facing away, that's night. Okay, I hope you remember those really terribly difficult terms. Okay, so we have the day side and the night side. Well, we actually have the exact same thing happening with the Moon. Half of the Moon is actually lit by sunlight, normally. We'll talk about it later, but occasionally the Moon will fall into the Earth's shadow. But assuming that it's not in the Earth's shadow, half of the Moon is going to be lit by the Sun, just like the Earth is. This means that we can talk about the day side of the Moon and the night side of the Moon. Now, the Sun is the only object in the solar system to actually give off its own visible light, which means the only reason we see the Moon is because of reflected light. So we see that half of the Moon is always lit by the Sun, and yet, from our perspective on the Earth, when we look up at the Moon, we don't always see half Moon. We actually see a whole wide variety of phases. The reason why we have this change of phase, why we see different amounts of the lit side of the Moon, is all because of perspective. And so in this diagram, we have us and then a baseball representing the Moon, and then a light shining towards it. In this first spot, A, as we look towards the baseball, all we see is the shaded side, the side in shadow, or the night side. And because it's going to be in the same direction as the light source, it's going to be very hard to actually see the baseball. As this moves along from point A over to point C, now as we look at it, we see half of the light side. Okay, so our perspective has changed because of how the ball is now oriented compared to us and the light source. Okay, so as it continues along over to point E, now as we look at the baseball, all we see is the lit side, and so on. So this is exactly what's happening with the Moon. So here we have the full cycle of phases of the Moon. Now this is something you're going to be required to know in order, so please pay attention and make sure you get it down. Now, it is a cycle, which means we could start it at whatever point, but it is traditional to begin with what is known as new moon. Okay, so new moon is the start of our cycle. Now, what you can see here is new moon is this first tiniest sliver. Technically, new moon is that first tiniest sliver where you can just barely start seeing the moon after it's disappeared for a while. But for the purposes of our course, it's when you don't see the moon. It's when the moon and the sun line up and you just don't see the moon at all. That's new moon. After new moon, we start to see more and more of the light side, and so we see it as this crescent shape. This is waxing crescent. So after new moon, we have waxing crescent. Waxing means to be growing or increasing, and it is crescent shaped because it's a crescent shape. That's why we call it crescent. Now, after waxing crescent, where we see half of the lit side, this is first quarter moon, okay, the first quarter. Now, the reason why we call it first quarter is we've now gone through 1/4 of the cycle. Okay, another way of remembering this is we're seeing half of the lit half, and half of a half is a quarter. So we have the first quarter moon. After first quarter, we then get waxing gibbous. Again, waxing means growing or increasing, and gibbous is the shape that's more than half, but it's not quite full yet. When it's in between the half to the full, that's the gibbous shape. After waxing gibbous, we then have full moon, where we see all of the lit side of the moon. Now, after full moon, we then have waning gibbous. So waning means to be shrinking or decreasing. So it's still that gibbous shape. It's more than half, but less than full. So it's gibbous, but it is decreasing, it is shrinking. After waning gibbous, we then have third quarter. Third quarter is what it sounds like. We've now gone through 3/4 of the cycle, and notice we're now looking at the other half of the moon. Then after third quarter, we have waning crescent. So it's that crescent shade again, but now it is decreasing, and that then brings us back to new moon. Okay, so this is the full cycle of phases. Something that I'd like to point out is how to tell whether it's waxing versus waning. So notice we have crescent on both sides, we've got quarters on both sides, and we've got gibbous on both sides. Okay, so there are two ways to tell. The first way I'm going to tell you will only work in the northern hemisphere. Okay, so if you're in the northern hemisphere, the way to tell waxing versus waning is by looking at what's happening on the right-hand side of the moon. Okay, if the right-hand side is light, then it is waxing. It's going to keep getting lighter. If the right-hand side is dark, then it is waning, and it's going to keep getting darker. Now again, that only works in the northern hemisphere. If you're in the southern hemisphere looking at the moon, you have to look on the left side. Okay, now something that works no matter where you are, this is our second way of telling waxing versus waning, is what time you're seeing the moon. If you're seeing the moon in the evening, shortly after sunset, or around the time of sunset, and it's obvious, then it's going to be waxing. If you see the moon and in the morning or towards sunrise, then it is waning. Okay, so waxing in the evening, waning in the morning. Now the bright side, the lit side of the moon, is so bright that it can actually be seen during the day. This is actually one of my pet peeves about some children's programming, is they talk about the moon only being up at night. It is absolutely not only up at night. I hope that you've actually noticed it during the day. Alright, here's our first lecture quiz question. How much of the moon is usually lit by the sun? A, depends on the time of the month. B, half. C, between half and full. Or D, between none and half. Go ahead and think about it, and we'll discuss in just a bit. So how much of the moon is usually lit by the sun? It is B, half. Half of the moon is lit by the sun. So then the follow-up question is, so why is it that we see the different phases? And I hope that you've picked up that it's all about the angle that we're looking at the moon. Okay, the moon is orbiting around the Earth, which means because of that angle we're viewing the moon, we're going to be seeing different amounts of that lit side. And because I'm mean like this, here's our second lecture quiz question. Which has the phases of the moon in order? A, waxing crescent, waning crescent, full. B, new, waning gibbous, third quarter. C, first quarter, waxing gibbous, full. D, third quarter, waning gibbous, waxing crescent. Let's see if you remember this one. So which of these has them in the correct order? It is C. First quarter is followed by waxing gibbous, is followed by full moon. So the correct answer is C.